Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer. I'm the host, Neil Trotter. And today, we're going to, talk about I'm centered this on queer theory. I guess that's a branch of feminist theory. I think so. But we're going to do that via a analysis of a text that's more psychology or clinical psychology or psychoanalysis, right? Which, there's some overlap there. If you go to the Venn diagram, you'll see there's some little intersections there, but I think we can make a lot of intersections and not just juxtapositions, but, insights and interconnectedness with this kind of these two fields. And I think the book that we're going to talk about does a nice job with that. And let me show you the book. It's okay. So I printed this out. Let's see if we can do this without the glare. It's Gender Without Identity. It is by Avgi, Saketopoulou, and Pellegrini. Okay. Make sure I pronounce those names correctly. First, I'd like to thank the publisher or somebody from whoever created this book sent me this for a review or just to read and talk about it on the channel, which is great. I know it's been a while since I was able to get to it because a lot of people send me stuff to read. And it was a minute, but we here. Now, the one thing about it, the issue was I didn't really know about this book. I was reading the blurb, like the little description about the summary of the book, and I'm like, I don't know. This doesn't align with my values in terms of, like, I guess I consider myself an ally. Although one can say, like, you don't really call yourself an ally. People under the LGBTQ plus umbrella or queer folk, they're the ones that deem you an ally. But I have a lot of loved ones who are queer and transgender and just various identities that fall within that umbrella. And I was like, okay, is this aligned with what I'm trying to be as an ally? So let me read you the blurb. It says, Gender Without Identity offers an innovative and at times unsettling theory of gender formation, rooted in meta-psychology of Jean Laplanche. Did I pronounce that correctly? And in conversation with bold work in queer and trans studies, Avgi, Saketopoulou, and Anne Pellegrini jettison core gender identity, quote unquote, to propose instead that gender is something all subjects acquire and that trauma sometimes has a share in that acquisition. Conceptualizing trauma alongside diverse genders and sexualities is thus not about invalidating transness and queerness, but about illuminating their textures to enable their flourishing. Okay. The thing that really confused me was just that trauma. I'm like, because I've heard that before. This idea like, when somebody becomes, people become queer by being traumatized, some traumatic event messed them up, and now they're like queer. It's like a psychological disorder or something like that. And so now they have to be sent into some institution or something and be converted back to, is that what this is? And then I was, it's not that at all. It's, I just want to say that's not what it is. But that was part of the, I'm just put this to the side, maybe read some other stuff. But I was wrong. I was right. And I was reading it to some of my friends and loved ones who identify as queer, trans, LGBTQIA plus, and I was reading it to them, and they're like, I don't know, man, Neil, it don't sound too good. I don't know. I think maybe the description, the blurb could be a little bit better, but that could just be non-deep reading of the blurb. So I gave it a chance. I'm like, I'll read it. I read books I disagree with, but I was pleasantly surprised. I'm like, this is some good stuff, and it does not take that position at all. In fact, it talks about trauma. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about that in depth. but it is a book that basically argues that the field of psychology, clinical psychology, psychoanalysis should take queer identity more seriously, and that, you know, psychology as an institution is, you know, kind of written with homophobia and anti-queerness, and that needs to change. And you know, but there's also, you know, these hang-ups about trauma, and we don't think about trauma in ways that are constructive, and we should be really considering how that does play into the way people think about who they are. It's a very deep, critical, very informative text that I really appreciate. Yeah, so I'm a fan of the book. And we'll talk about it. So here at the Black Ponderer, what we do is that we read quotes from the book. I actually read texts from the book, and then I just add my supplementary commentary about themes from the book that I find interesting, more, you know, on the realm of philosophical themes. And then we'll just continue the discussion down below if you like in the comments section. Feel free. So I begin on page Roman numeral 8, because this is the preface. Now, this is a digital copy, and this might actually be an early version of the book, not sure. So I don't know if these page numbers align completely. It's a digital copy. I printed it out, so I'm just gonna say, this is Roman numeral page 8, because oftentimes I have viewers, they ask me, can you please give me the page number of what you're reading? So I'm gonna give you the page number, but you might have a modern copy of the book, like an actual printout, or just like the real digital version. It might not align, but anyway, this is the preface, page 8, 4th line. It is in the nature of the human being to treat experiences that are difficult, painful, even traumatizing. Out of that treatment can arise self-theorizations, in this case, psychoanalytic theorizations, that are not efforts to cope with or to survive trauma, but that, to the contrary, take up the energies roused by trauma to invent something new. In saying this, we are taking an unusual approach to trauma, asserting that trauma produces more than misery, even as misery is neither to be denied nor dismissed. So I put in my notes like, uh-oh, what's going on here? Is this pain equals progress, progress equals pain? I'm not really into that type of philosophy where you just, you know, suffering creates, you know, identity and character. I'm like, yeah, yes and no, but sometimes we play that up too much, and, you know, there's pleasure also creates character too, right? And then, you know, the fixation on trauma, I'm like very wary about. But the text goes on to more critically discuss this idea, and I got on board. So let me continue. I skipped down 3 lines here. Trauma may have a share in the constitutional queer and trans life. We will shortly explain why we dare this risky theorizing. It is risky. You almost got me like DNFing the book, right? Did not finish, but I stuck to it. And yeah, it was good. Why we feel it is urgent and necessary, and why such a link is neither transphobic, nor does it have to tip into conversion practices, right? That, you know, sending somebody to some camp and shit, and like trying to turn them back from to straight or heterosexual type of, no, we don't want to deal with that, and they don't want to deal with that either. But I skipped down 6 lines. As a psychic process, this spinning is not about consciously produced self-understandings or meaning-making that proceeds from a centered self. It is rather a more decentered process, having to do with how trauma forces the psyche to respond, which means that the psyche has to innovate and to invent. So yeah, and that's pretty cool, this idea that's talked about how there is really no central self, rather the self constantly is constructing a new version of self, right? And they're just inventing a self that there's no core concept of self. So, and then that's what's the idea of gender without identity. It's hard to do the cover because it's just a big binder. So let me stop doing that. But gender without identity, right? Meaning like there's no core center. Rather, there's just constant creation that like sprouts out branches and zigzags and evolves, and that determines the sense of the self. But we'll get more into that too. I skip down the line. Such theorizations do not issue from a pre-existing self. Rather, self-theorization is critical to the constitution of subjectivity. Okay. The book has a very good preface because it really does address the risky proposition where it might turn people away who are allies, people who are pro-transgender being, queer being, who have loved ones, who want to see the people who identify as those modes of being to prosper and to enjoy life and to continue to grow and find themselves. The preface does a good job addressing that and breaking it down in a very succinct way too, but in depth and deep. So the preface got me, it got me hooked. That's why it's important to, some people will skip like introductions and prefaces and let me just get to chapter 1. Oftentimes you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to do that. So this is page Roman numeral 12. So we're still in the preface. This is the second paragraph. We find the notion of core gender identity italicized, at best simplistic and at worst problematic. The idea that anyone is at core straight or gay or bi, cis or trans or non-binary, or insert your gender term here, reasserts a kind of Ptolemaic cosmology of gender and sexuality in which the true self is the centered core around which a sun of meanings rotates. We posit that anything that characterizes our sense of self precipitates through how we treat the other's incursion into us. The self is thus what gets crafted in the wake of and in the effort to treat that invasiveness. At stake is not essence, for example, was the subject is self-theorized at any one particular moment. Then I skip to page 13, Roman numeral 13, second line. We want to offer a way of thinking that permits analysts to work with ideas that have to do with the subject's development. And here they're specifically talking about, because they're clinical psychologists, right? And so, they talk about their patients, but not just the patients. Maybe they're just reading about a patient that was treated by another psychologist, and now that's their subject. So they're specifically talking about the field of psychology, but I like to also carry this over to philosophy. So with family history and with intergenerational factors, which may become elements through which the subject improvises their gender. To situate gender in the domain of translation is to say that there is nothing authentic about one's gender other than one's experience of it. And it is also to sign up for gender as a widely improvisational process, which is not rooted in any observable or objective fact, e.g. body morphology or chromosomes, nor in any imaginary interiorized idea, e.g. core gender identity. What this means is that gender cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed. It simply exists in relation to how it is experienced at the moment. It just harkens to like that very old school, but I guess not so much old school, right? But early 90s idea from the philosopher, critical theorist Judith Butler. We talked about how gender is performative, but performative not in like the simple theatrical sense, right? Performative in like the life experience sense. And so these authors here are breaking that down even further and like going really deep into like, well, what does that mean? Gender being performative. And then so there's a description right there. It's based off of responding to life experiences and then acting out your life based on those responses to explore and discover yourself, as well, to define yourself, and also to assert yourself, right? To be in the world through experience, reacting to life as it reacts to you. And that's how gender comes out. And so in this way, there isn't this situation where, well, you're not doing gender right, right? Because it's like, well, this is my lived experience, and I'm reacting in the way that is appropriate for me, based off of how I feel and how life has treated me. It's a unique experience, unique to oneself, but it's perpetuated or influenced by the outside too. So it's here where like trauma, right? The idea of trauma starts to come into play, right? So now I'm thinking like, oh, okay, I see how you can incorporate trauma into this theory, this concept of gender in a way that's not dismissive, but is explanatory. We're still in the preface. This is page 28, and this is the second line at the top. The path of gender becoming is always related to the droppings of others who preceded us, the others of family and of culture. Some of these droppings we propose may have to do with trauma. It makes sense, right? And we're going to continue on to this explanation because it's still kind of a slippery slope, but they do a good job giving you those suction cups so you can stick onto the slippery slope and be like, okay, I understand what you're saying. Okay, so I skip down to the third paragraph. Okay, this is the end of that first line. Gender and sexual experience accrues out of processes of self-theorization, translation, but also detranslation and retranslation, which have more to do with felt experience than with truth or with authenticity. So I'll let you know, let's break this down. Let's think about this for a minute. You're translating, like the world tells you like, okay, you're a guy, you're a man. And so men have to do this, this, and this. They have to be tough, they have to play sports. And so like somebody who is okay with that, they're like, okay, I can align with that. They translate that, okay, I'm gonna go out in the world, I'm gonna work out at the gym, pump the iron, get really into sports, or do whatever stereotypical manly thing, normative manly thing. So they're translating what they've received and then they express their manliness, right? We see this all the time, right? Or, right, there's some other people who are like, yeah, I don't jive with that. I don't jive with that. You say that I'm a man and I'm supposed to be doing this, but I don't like sports, or I'm more into other things, or I don't like being aggressive and violent and dominant. And let me do this other thing, right? And so they detranslate it. And you can see that expressed in queer culture. But of course, it's not that simple, right? There's all these shades in between where people are translating and then they're also detranslating at the same time. It's like, I can be aggressive sometimes, if we're just sticking to like what it means to be masculine. I can be aggressive sometimes, but sometimes I don't. Maybe I'm like kind of submissive, sometimes, or I'm just like a little docile at times. And that I'm going to incorporate that into my manhood, whatever that means. So it gets complicated, this translation, detranslation. That's why I'm very actually personally attracted to like queer theory as like a philosophical analysis of like the human being, because it shows that human beings are a lot more complex than we give credit for, that general society credits human beings as. We're not just this one type of thing based off of these tropes or these social ideas. Like the people are very complex, and they're constantly constructing new ways of being, right? That's what they're saying here. Okay, still the preface. Okay, this is page 29, Roman numeral. Okay, this is 11th line. Thinking about gender as having a history of becoming, because it is that translation of what you're exposed to, right? What you're exposed to, and then constructing something new or constructing something that already is, just reconstructing what has been into something that's new. So you look at, what does it mean to be a human being? It's based off of what has been considered what it means to be a human, and what will be based off of the reactions of people receiving the history of what it means to be human and constructing new things about what it means to be human. I think I described that in a way that's understandable. Let's keep going. Maybe we could make that more understandable. So gender is a self-creation via performative living based on experiential reaction. I just put that as my notes to try and summarize what I'm thinking. This is queer theory. But we're reading this clinical psychology book in regards to gender to come up with these queer theory ideas, right? But let me read you this. We're on page 16 now. We're out of the preface. This is the 7th line. Gender is something we all acquire, and consequently that all genders have a constitution we can probe, examine, and theorize. Gender constitution, in other words, extend beyond the body's sex markers and bodily morphology and cannot be taken as the arbiter of what gender one is or will become. Gender assignment, which is usually based on visual inspection of this bodily morphology at birth, is not a description of a truth which the child may successfully express or from which they may later deviate. That's not what it is. So what is it? But a set of propositional statements and practices that the child may or may not adopt. That's what it is. It's the reaction. It's the lived experience, right? It's the performance of life, right? It's not so much the description of what the person is doing, or, and they talk about a child because they're focusing on children in terms of psychoanalysis. I'm making the analysis broader, just in general. You describe that's masculine, that's feminine, and that's queer, that's trans, you're making these descriptions. And what is trans? Well, that's when you act a certain way, but it was different from the assigned at birth, and it's we make all these descriptions, right? But they're saying that's not necessarily, or even that's not what gender is. Gender is the response to all that. The lived experience, the actions that are taken as a result, which may fall outside those descriptions, right? Which is why we keep continuing to see the letters LGBTQIA+, right? Because it's people are constantly developing new ways of being that fall outside these definitions. And so we have to make these further definitions, right? Which are not what queerness necessarily is, but they're just approximations. They're just labels that we give to talk about these things, right? But gender is this creation, this reconstruction, this retranslation, right? This detranslation, right? Of being through action. Right, through lived action. An individual's gender, in our view, the author's view, is not explicable through notions of true gender or core gender identity. For this reason, while we strongly oppose the hunt for etiological factors, as if the why can ever be pinned down, we still advocate for thinking about the development in a dynamic way, which is to say, in a way that considers the unconscious and the sexual. And so the authors who are in the field of psychology, talk about the unconscious mind or the unconscious, right? And they talk about how there's an unconscious sexual existence that is expressed, that exists, right? And that has a play into gender as well. And then we talk about how so. And so it's complicated, right? The unconscious mind, very complicated. So you're receiving these ideas, these concepts of sexuality, and the unconscious interprets those ideas and expressions. And also there's one's own unconscious has their own conceptions of what's happening in their sexual being, right? And that also contributes to how they express themselves and how they live, how they construct their gender, right? Which may or may not fall in line with society's definitions or current definitions of gender, but still influence their constructions of gender. Let's talk more about how that manifests, particularly how gender is created and how trauma plays a part in that creation, which is the risky thing, right? But they do a great job, the authors, about explaining that. Let's go to page 22. This is the second line at the top. We believe that the field is in dire need of analytic ideas that don't capitulate to the notion that the only way to construct the pathologizing of sexual and gender non-normativities is by imagining them to be innate. So what they talk about? The field psychology, right? And, I will go further, adding my supplementary discussion here. Philosophy needs to go further as well with these analytic ideas, okay? I skipped to the second paragraph. Thinking about gender as encompassing processes of becoming as opposed to ontological ones is clinically important and theoretically exciting, right? So ontological, so that's philosophy, right? Being able to formulate clinical hypotheses about how someone's gender, normative or not, came into being can illuminate possible development paths that could, in turn, clinically support the flourishing of our atypically gendered patients. So this is great because it's giving you the intersection of like philosophy and practice. Right? When you consider ontology, right? When you consider that, which is a branch of metaphysics, talking about the nature of being, right? The nature of being, right? And we incorporate that in very practical fields that are used to help people in dire need, like psychology, clinical psychology, right? These are very necessary fields that help human beings cope with life, needed fields that are part of healthcare. Philosophy, like very critical, well thought out philosophy, needs to be incorporated in these like fields like clinical psychology to develop meaningful help for people. So clinically important, and it's theoretically exciting. The other thing, doing this kind of thing also sheds light to the true diverse nature of being, just generally. That's kind of the question that I'm focusing on. That's very important to me at this moment, like the true nature of being, and I'm coming to this realization that it's extremely diverse. Like being, we've limited the nature of being, right? We defined it as a very limited thing, right? Where it's really this wide range that our society chooses to just not accept because it doesn't meet the interests of our current institutional power structures, right? But that's really hindering humans' ability to just develop further as like human beings, right? And this text right here sheds a lot of light to that. Okay, this is page 23, last paragraph, third line. Thinking trauma alongside gender diversity easily capsizes into conversion attempts. Gotta be careful, but why? Why? That's what the text asks. Why is it that analysis can work so skillfully with cis patients in ways that consider how trauma inflects cis femininities and cis masculinities, but these same analysis cannot apply the same principles when working with gendered and sexual minorities without tipping into trying to eliminate difference? The answer seems obvious. Cisgenders are seen as natural, and where trauma does occur, such trauma is seen as part of the vicissitudes of normative gender. Atypical genders, on the other hand, are seen a priori as abnormal, and as such, any trauma is seen as warping normal gender to produce a distorted one. What we need to question then is the presumed naturalness of cisgender and not to continue impoverished conversations about gender and sexual polymorphism, right? That's a very good point. I think the authors talk about trauma phobia, where we can't be so adverse about talking about how trauma influences oneself. And, they aptly point out hey, we talk about trauma all the time when it comes to cis people. you got to address your trauma, and you got to work with your trauma, and your trauma might never go away, but here's ways to manage it, right? And they don't get sent to like conversion camps to be like turned into some being, but we do that with atypical genders, right? Like queer, transgender, such and such, right? Because of the homophobia and the transphobia and all that. So what needs to be questioned is this idea of core gender identity. So again, I almost did it. Wait a minute, I could back up. Oh no, it's too much glare. Gender without identity, right? Gender without identity, where there is no core gender identity, where gender becomes this constant evolution, or this constant translation, detranslation, reconstruction, deconstruction of being, that's a manifestation of self based off one's actual lived experience, rather than basing it off of this core identity that one may go away from or go toward. It's like, no, it's just this constant growth. Whereas trauma is just one of those things that influences one's development, one's construction of one's being, whether it might hinder it, it might like set it a different route, but the self always is in some sort of control of construction or deconstruction. The self is always manifesting or asserting one's self to address the influence. And that's what gender is. Okay, this is page 25, line 8. All gender formations are physically meaningful appearances with material and psychic consequences. To say that gender is an appearance is not to say that gender is illusory or can be changed at will, but that gender is rather about how something psychic appears phenomenally. So how the unconscious like manifests into like lived experience, right? Is another way to put it, I guess. What makes gender experience real is that it exists on the level of psychic reality, where experienced as truth, it becomes central to one's sense of self. Even as psychic reality, however, gender identification also requires the oxygen of relation recognition. I skipped down the line. We do well to remember that psychic reality is provisional, not a fixed state, but potentially mobile one. It is precisely that mobility that implicates the subject's becoming and the subject's autonomy. So again, there's not a core identity that the self is fixed in. Rather, oneself is constantly navigating through life, receiving influences from the external world, from the outside, whether that's family members doing things to them, strangers, institutions. Some of those things are traumatic, some of them are not, but they're navigating through all that and they're responding to it, but they are the self is responding to it, right? In a way that manifests their lived experience in this thing that we call gender. This page 26, this 14th line. All gender is constructed out of the raw materials of what the other wants from or for us. Said differently, the other's invasion does not determine who we become. Rather than invasion sets in motion the very process of our subjectivation. It is rather the response to this puncturing that consolidates as the ego and also our experience of our gender. So again, to repeat what I was saying as my supplementary commentary, things happen to us and we respond, right? But we are responding, like the self responds. Like, yes, things happen to us. Some of those things are traumatic. Like, and then if we want to be specific about like gender expression, right? Like, oh, you're supposed to be masculine. Why aren't you masculine, right? And then, so you get these ideas of masculinity, and then you respond to that. Is your choice. Now, there's a lot of things that influence that choice. Sometimes, like, the state or the institutional power over you might be like, you need to do this thing, and if you don't do it, there are going to be dire consequences, and then you have to decide based off of that whether you still want to express your identity in certain ways or not. But you express it in certain ways, and you're the one doing it. Yeah, there are influences, but you're the one still doing it. It's our navigation of these invasive forces in our society that try and dictate the ideas of who we are. It's our navigation dealing with that, dealing with the societal pressures, and still moving forward, expressing our sense of self. This is what gender is. Okay, page 28, third line. If there is no final destination to gender, we may arrive at our gender not once and for all, but over and over again. For some individuals, gender could shift more than once across the lifespan. And you see this often, like, I have loved ones that are like, oh, I thought I was a lesbian. For the longest time, I identified as a lesbian. I have a loved one who has told me this, shared me this. And then after a while, they realize like, oh no, I'm actually bisexual. That's what I am. I'm bisexual, right? And then they realized, oh wait, no, I'm pansexual. I'm pansexual. That's what I am, right? And of course, like maybe there's a naysayer, somebody like, whoa, you're either one or the other. You're not like these multiple things, or it's like you always was pansexual. You just had to find your way to it through these mistakes. Whereas the authors are saying, no, at certain points in your life, the being is dynamic. Maybe you were, quote unquote, straight heterosexual at one point. Then you arrived at the identity of lesbian because that was closest to who you thought you were, which is what you were. Not only did you think that's what you were, that's what you were, because the psychic unconscious mind is your true reality at that moment in time, right? And then you changed through your dynamic unconscious being, and you're like, okay, I'm bisexual, and then pansexual. You're all these things at a different point. There is no one specific thing you are at all times, right? At any moment, your being could change, because being is like constant discovery. Okay, we're at page 29. This is the second paragraph. If we view gender as a matter of self-theorizing and not some true core, it becomes possible to imagine that trauma can inflect gender experience without implying that this amounts to a distortion of an authentic self. Because the authentic self is not some core identity. The authentic self is the exploration. It is the navigation. It is the changing of self. Like that is what's the authentic self. And I skip down the line. We are pushing back against the assumption that gender is immune to trauma, or that gender, in order to be healthy, is uncontaminated by early traumatic intrusions, by adult interventions, or by the emotional debris of intergenerational pressures, right? Those all play into like one's being. Just like anything, right? It's not just gender, is, all aspects of oneself are influenced by outside experiences, right? And a lot of those times those are traumatic, which is not to discount your being, is to say like this played a part in who I am. And I have responded in those experiences in this way, and I take ownership to those responses, that I have done. At the same time, there are all these other things externally that I didn't have control over, which played a part in who I am. Is mixed. Is a mixture of external and internal influences that creates self. Skip down 3 lines. Traumatic incursion is always at work in all gender becoming. As long as the subject is able to modify what has handed down to them intergenerationally and to forge out of those inheritances their own gender translations, gender is not pathology. To say this differently, no gender is unspoiled by trauma or uncontaminated by parental conflict. It's similar in ways to like, let's take for example, black being, right? Like, Black Ponderer, here we go again, Black Ponderer. What does it mean to be black? Like, what does it mean to be black, right? Is it just because I have non-white skin? Like, is that what it means? I have black, brown skin, right? What does it mean to be black? That's a large question, right? And how is it that I'm black? Well, one thing that black people, like, what do all black people have in common, right? Well, I will say, like, one thing all black people have in common, and this could be like a description. Part of the description of being black is that we all share this trauma of this intergenerational trauma, state institutionalized oppression, discrimination, exploitation, whether it be the early days of American slavery, right? Or you can even go before that, right? Or Jim Crow. As an African American, I'm kind of centering my experience on United States of America, but Jim Crow, and now that we are, Jim Crow has ended, but of course, institutional societal racism still exists, as we all have seen in political news these days with like the criminal justice system and, police officers still targeting people of color disproportionately, and that's nothing new. That's been around since the founding of America. And one thing that all black people share is that trauma. And one black person can say, well, I've never been called the N-word before. I don't think I've ever experienced racism, but if you live in America, there's still like racism is baked into our institution. It's baked into our societal systems, right? And so that's something we all share. So does that define blackness? Does that define black people? No. We have constructed a way of being through our art, like hip hop, jazz. We've created many art forms that are like started by black people. Rock and roll was started by black people. Various forms of art, various forms of business, food, other types of culture, celebrations like Juneteenth or something like that, African American History Month. I mean, we could just go on and on. And these are all definitions of like what it means to be black. They're aspects of blackness, but they have all been influenced by this shared trauma. But it's important to understand, like, the trauma does not negate the authenticity of blackness. So, one could come at me and say, like, well, what do you mean? Like, do you mean like being black means being traumatized? Is that what you're reducing it to? No, like, I'm not reducing it to that. We have risen through that and with that trauma to create a sense of being that is incredible and creative and marvelous. But there's still that trauma that is still exists within us that we all share as black people, right? As black folk, right? And so, you talk about trauma in terms of gender, like that exists in other aspects of identity and being as well, right? And so I read this saying like, yeah, I get it. I understand it. It's not to say like, oh, what are you saying? Like the gender, people who are like trans or, queer, they're like traumatized and like they need to address their trauma, and like, no. But what we are saying is that trauma does play a part in the gender formation, because we do live in a world where gender is specifically defined, right? But not all beings exist in that definition, and then they have to navigate through that and experience the trauma of creating outside of that institutional power that's constantly pressuring them to conform, right? Even though they for a lot of times to conform is to die, so they have to like break out of that, which can be traumatic, right? Similar to like being black, right? In many ways, but also in different ways as well, right? And that's what we're talking about here. This is page 30, last paragraph. This querying of development then is not about noting where things went off course so that analysis may intervene to course correct, nor does it mean identifying where psychic life got bent out of shape, quote unquote, so that it may be straightened out. Instead, we seek to foster spaces for thinking about the evolving dynamic dimensions of how patients, children especially, but also adults, change over time and come to their own idiosyncratic gender translations, especially those that may not line up with binary or gender expansive dictionaries. Such thinking offers entry points for the analysis who has done the serious personal work of thinking about gender overall and their own in particular, to engage their atypically gendered patients in more nuanced ways. Clinical psychologists can take that understanding and help aid in the positive, constructive formation of their patients as they navigate through life, dealing with the challenges of life. And I would just take that in the other direction of like, as philosophers, as we consider how the nature of being, and we talk about ontology, right? We can start to like think about positive aspects of human being and start like really constructing like, okay, what does it really mean to be human? Can that really be defined? Not really. But, you know, we can talk about how humans construct their being in ways that are diverse and plentiful and progressive. So gender is the creative process of being, not a static, innate core identity. We're at page 68, third line. What makes one's gender feel one's own is not its independence from the object, but the freedom to weave together mythos, symbolic codes, including the ones related to the parent's trauma, with relative autonomy from the other's control. You know, it's like being black, right? You learn about like the days of slavery and Jim Crow, and you're like, all right, I get that. You know, when you get pulled over by the cops, you gotta act a certain way, or there's gonna be trouble, right? I'm gonna take that, I'm gonna navigate in the world with that knowledge, with that being, and I'm gonna make something new. You know, I'm gonna be black in ways that are gonna be progressive, or, you know, maybe not so much progressive. They're just, you know, you're being black in ways that assert the self, manifest one's being despite that, right? Or with that, you know what I'm saying? And we see that in like the queer community. It's like, all right, there's these symbolic understandings of masculine and femininity. I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna just, you know, I may, you know, embrace that, but like flip it on his head, or I might create new structures. You see that in like drag, you see that in trans, you see that in non-binary identity, you see that in asexual identities. You're taking these established identities and then you're running off with these constructions in your own idiosyncratic ways. We write relative autonomy because translations are never entirely independent from the object and its influence, right? I'm just saying. Autonomy refers rather to the other, whether the adult, the analyst, the lawmaker, etc., not trying to exercise control over the child's translational process. Because, you know, when it's all said and done, you still have control, despite how oppressive the system is. And, you know, the control might be very limited, but there is this self that is expressing oneself. You know, there is this self-navigating, trying to be in this societal system, making decisions and choices that belong to the self and do not belong specifically to the external pressures and influences. Okay, this is page 96. This is a 10th line. Gender is not a private language. It requires at least two parties and is embroiled in entire life worlds and world orders. Gender implicates us with others, makes us vulnerable to their address, into ways they do and do not call our names, the ways they do and do not hold us in mind, the ways they do and do not lust after us. Okay, so for gender to manifest, there needs to be a back and forth. It's dialectical. That's what I'm saying, to make it Hegelian or whatever. Gender doesn't exist on one's own, right? Gender is a performance where there is an audience, right? There's an audience, but you know, it's the audience of life, right? Right? As you live through life, you're living amongst people, and your self-expression, you're expressing to somebody. You know, you're expressing it for yourself, to yourself, but you're also expressing it with other people, and that life performance is received, right, and responded to, right, and then you, as a result of that response, act in ways that you decide based off of the influences that you've received, but also your unconscious mind, your psychic, right, being, and what you feel is an appropriate navigation in this thing we call life. So in the end, like gender, well, first of all, there is no end, right? Gender has no end, and then gender also is undefinable. There is no definition of gender. Gender is only a creation. Is a creation of self, not all of self, but a significant part of self. This is page 115, third line. Freud, quoting Freud here, in conformity with its peculiar nature, psychoanalysis does not try to describe what a woman is. That would be a task it could scarcely perform, but sets about inquiring how she comes into being. Freud said that, right? You can't define what a woman is. What is a woman? Undefinable. The only thing you can hope to do is to understand how the woman came to be, whatever a woman is, right? It's the same thing with gender. And then the authors put, in Freud, we have something quite extraordinary in that his statement is completely contradictory. Freud tells us she becomes what we are incapable of defining. But isn't that life? Like, what is life? Like, there's no definition to that, right? What is life? The only thing that we can talk about in terms of life is how we arrive at how we live, right? We can't define what life is, but we can sure as hell talk about how we live. We can talk about the how. We can't. It's hard to talk about the what, right? But the how is where really the substance is. It really is. The what is the substance too, but the what is undefinable, is it not? Boy, I have to say, I had a very mistaken perception of this book. I was like, I'm gonna disagree with this one, but I read it and I'm like, whoa, this book is awesome. Gender Without Identity, and I would highly recommend it if you're trying to get a grip on like queer theory and trying to get really in depth about, okay, what is this thing we call gender? If you're really seriously trying to really think about it in serious ways rather than this surface level, superficial gender ideology type of like thing we see in the media nowadays, like this very half-ass approach to the understanding gender. If you're trying to get more in depth, check that book out. I wholeheartedly recommend it. Gender Without Identity by, here we go, Avgi, Saketopoulou, and Pellegrini. It's not hard. It's like the way it's spelled is the way it's pronounced. It's not hard. It's just I'm just very bad with pronouncing, even like the most straightforward stuff. Anyway, just thanks for sending a free copy of this book to me, a free digital copy. I'm just kind of honored that, you send a cishet like me a book like that, kind of trusting that I could give a good critical take on it. And it's pretty, I'm pretty, thanks for that. I'm pretty honored for that. And yeah, sorry it took so damn long. That was my bad. It took a while to get to, but I don't know what to say. There's no excuse for it. It's just I was slow. Anyway, you've been watching The Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.